The streets of the city had a rhythm all their own, a harsh, relentless beat that gnawed at the soul. Streetlights flickered intermittently, casting pale halos onto cracked sidewalks where shadows moved like ghosts. The millionaire, draped in impeccably tailored clothing, moved through this terrain like a visitor from another world. His polished shoes clicked against the concrete, a sound so alien in the night that even the rats scuttling between trash piles seemed to pause and watch. He was mourning, though nobody could see it. The absence of his daughter, snatched away by fate in an instant, had left him hollow. His eyes carried that grief that no public display could mask, a quiet, simmering storm behind a veneer of composure. And tonight, his storm was about to collide with someone else's. A girl emerged from the shadows, a figure so slight and fragile that the harsh wind seemed capable of shattering her entirely. Her skin was black as midnight, absorbing the glow from every street lamp, yet it seemed to shine with an inner strength that defied her circumstance. Clothes hung loosely on her body, frayed and weathered, yet she carried herself with a dignity that no amount of neglect could erase. Her eyes, wide and defiant, met his with a gaze that dared him to look away. "Sir," she said, her voice trembling only slightly, "those girls, they live on my street." For a moment he did not respond. The sound of her words, simple yet weighted with meaning, seemed to echo in the alleyways around them. She was speaking of something ordinary, children, girls, but in that ordinary statement there was a gravity, an urgency he could not ignore. He studied her, really studied her, for the first time. This was no street kid lost in misfortune. This was someone who had survived what many would not even dare to imagine. And yet, there was more than survival here. There was courage. There was pride. She stepped closer, her bare feet scuffing against the cracked pavement. "Sir, they don't eat," she said. Her voice cracked now, raw with emotion. "And they're too afraid to sleep at night because—" She swallowed hard, struggling with the weight of her own words. He watched the tiny tremor in her hands, the way her shoulders braced against the night. Every word she spoke carried a weight that no amount of money could fix. Because the men, they come and they take whatever they want, and no one cares. No one. Please, you have to help them. His chest tightened. He felt the sting of helplessness, not the kind that came from watching the news or reading reports, but the kind that penetrated deep into the heart, the kind that comes when you see injustice with your own eyes. He had wealth, influence, and power, but here, in this moment, none of it seemed enough. The girl's courage exposed him, stripped away his defenses. And yet, he could not walk away. "Where?" he asked quietly. His voice was almost lost amidst the hum of distant traffic, but she heard it. Relief flickered across her features, though it was quickly replaced by the hardened resolve that came from a lifetime of struggle. She motioned down a side street, narrow and cluttered, lined with abandoned buildings and crumbling brick walls. "There," she said. "They're just there. Please, sir, I can't do this alone anymore." He followed her, his polished shoes crunching on broken glass, ignoring the protests of his own body that whispered of discomfort, of danger, of the unknown. The air grew colder as they walked, and he felt a strange sense of dislocation, as if the world he had known, the world of luxury, of security, of predictable order, was peeling away with each step. She led him into a courtyard framed by graffiti and rusting fire escapes, where children huddled under threadbare blankets, their eyes wary yet curious at the intrusion of an outsider. The millionaire knelt down, lowering himself to their level. He wanted to speak, to say the right thing, but words felt inadequate. How could they comprehend that someone who had never known hunger or fear could suddenly care so deeply? One little girl, no older than 7, approached him cautiously. Her hair was knotted and dirty, but her eyes, oh, her eyes, held a brightness, a spark that refused to be extinguished. He reached out, and she flinched instinctively, then hesitated, then took his hand. The girl from the street, the one who had led him here, watched silently. She had learned long ago that hope was a dangerous thing, fragile and easily shattered. Yet tonight, as she saw this stranger kneel among the children, something flickered, a fragile promise that maybe, just maybe, there could be a difference. He looked at her then, really looked. "Why are you out here?" he asked softly, not accusingly, but with a quiet urgency. Her answer was simple, devastating in its honesty. "Because no one else will help. Because I'm the only one who can." She paused, her chest rising and falling in quick, shallow breaths. "I've tried, I've begged, I've watched, and I've failed before, but I can't fail them again." The millionaire felt a lump rise in his throat. He had lost someone precious, and yet here, in the shadowed courtyard, he realized that loss could be transformed into action. He realized that privilege without purpose was hollow. He realized that true courage was not measured by wealth, but by the willingness to face injustice, to take risks, and to stand for those who could not stand for themselves. She told him stories then, one after the other. Stories of small triumphs, heartbreaking defeats, nights of terror, and days of hunger. Each tale carved lines of sorrow and resilience into the space between them. And as she spoke, he began to see the world differently, not as a series of transactions and gains, but as a tapestry of human suffering and perseverance, each thread sacred, each life meaningful. The millionaire, once distant and insulated, began to feel something he had thought impossible: connection. Connection is not born from convenience or calculation, but from recognition of shared humanity. Here was a girl, so young, so scarred by life, and yet possessing a bravery he could scarcely comprehend. Here were children who had been written off by society, who had been rendered invisible, and yet whose very existence demanded acknowledgement and demanded action. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his wallet, but before he could offer money, the girl stopped him. "Sir," she said firmly, "they don't need charity. They need justice. They need someone to care enough to fight for them, not just throw coins and walk away." Her gaze was unwavering, a challenge that struck him like lightning. He realized then that wealth could be a tool, but it could also be a cage. He had to act with intention, with thought, with courage. The night deepened, and still they sat there, surrounded by a fragile circle of blankets, bottles, and the remnants of lives lived on the margins. The millionaire listened, learnt, and understood that his mourning, once a solitary, consuming grief, could be transformed into purpose. And the girl, for her part, allowed herself a rare flicker of hope. For the first time in a long time, she believed that someone outside their world could see, could understand, and could act. As the first light of dawn began to pierce the gloom, he stood. The girl rose beside him. "We'll start today," he said, more to himself than to her. "We'll start with them. And then we'll fight for the rest." She nodded, and for the first time, a genuine smile broke across her face, a smile born not of relief, but of possibility. Together they stepped out of the alley, stepping into a world that had long ignored them, stepping into a fight that would demand every ounce of strength, courage, and dignity they possessed. And though the city remained cold, indifferent, and dangerous, a spark had been lit, a spark that could not be extinguished. The streets had not changed, though now they felt different, harsher, more urgent, more alive with the possibility of confrontation. The millionaire, once insulated by his wealth and grief, had stepped into a world that demanded courage at every turn. Every alley, every broken door, every flickering lamp whispered stories of survival that no boardroom, no mansion, no title could ever replicate. And the girl, the black homeless girl who had dared to speak, became his compass, guiding him through a landscape of fear, resilience, and unacknowledged pain. They began with the basics: food, clothing, and blankets. But it quickly became clear that basic needs were only the surface. The deeper wounds, the kind invisible to the eye, were rooted in neglect, in societal blindness, in the kind of systemic disregard that left entire streets to fend for themselves while the world moved on. She led him through courtyards, through abandoned buildings converted into makeshift homes, past playgrounds that had long been abandoned, their swings creaking like ghosts. Everywhere he looked, there were faces that told stories of hunger, of fear, of brilliance buried beneath circumstance. It was during one of these nights, when the wind cut sharper than knives and the city hummed a bitter lullaby, that they first encountered the threat that made her warnings so urgent. Two men appeared at the end of a narrow passage, their shadows stretching long and menacing in the weak light. The children shrank back instinctively, instinct sharper than trust. The millionaire felt a cold surge of panic, but the girl moved forward, body tense, eyes blazing. "Stay behind me," she whispered, though her voice carried the force of command. The men approached, words sharp and cruel, demanding what little the children had: food, blankets, anything of value. And for a moment, the millionaire froze, torn between instinctual fear and a rising sense of responsibility. But then he saw her, the girl who had lived through nights like this for years, standing unflinching, defiance radiating from every inch of her frame. She didn't cower, she didn't plead, she simply spoke, her voice steady and unyielding. "You leave them alone. Now." The men laughed, a sound that was meant to intimidate, to mock, but she did not back down. And something changed in the millionaire at that moment. The hollow grief he had carried since losing his daughter merged with the righteous anger he had felt since seeing the injustice around him. He stepped forward, placing himself beside her, and said quietly but firmly, "Go." It was not a confrontation of fists or weapons. It was a confrontation of presence, of moral authority, of courage backed by conviction. And against all odds, the men retreated, slipping back into the shadows, leaving only a lingering sense of danger that would not easily fade. The children, trembling but unharmed, looked at the two of them with eyes wide in awe. For the first time, someone from outside their world had not only seen their plight, but had stood with them against it. From that night forward, the millionaire understood that his mourning could no longer be passive. His grief could fuel action. He had money, yes, but he also had influence, the ability to draw attention, to rally resources, and to challenge institutions that had long ignored the voices of the marginalized. And she, the girl who had refused to be broken by circumstance, became his guide, not only to the streets, but also to the truth. They began reaching out, first to local organizations, then to the media, then to people of influence who had long shielded themselves from the realities of the streets. Each step was met with resistance, skepticism, dismissive attitudes, and outright hostility. But the girl never faltered. She shared names, locations, incidents, and truths that were impossible to ignore. Her courage became contagious, her resolve a force that even the most cynical could not deny. It was during these efforts that the millionaire began to see the systemic nature of the problem. It was not random misfortune, it was design, neglect, and indifference. Every policy, every loophole, every bureaucracy seemed stacked against the most vulnerable. And the girl, so young, so scarred, yet so fierce, taught him what action truly meant. Not charity, not pity, but justice, advocacy, and accountability. And against all odds, the men retreated, slipping back into the shadows, leaving only a lingering sense of danger that would not easily fade. The children, trembling but unharmed, looked at the two of them with eyes wide in awe. For the first time, someone from outside their world had not only seen their plight, but had stood with them against it. From that night forward, the millionaire understood that his mourning could no longer be passive. His grief could fuel action. He had money, yes, but he also had influence, the ability to draw attention, to rally resources, and to challenge institutions that had long ignored the voices of the marginalized. And she, the girl who had refused to be broken by circumstance, became his guide, not only to the streets, but also to the truth. They began reaching out, first to local organizations, then to the media, then to people of influence who had long shielded themselves from the realities of the streets. Each step was met with resistance, skepticism, dismissive attitudes, and outright hostility. But the girl never faltered. She shared names, locations, incidents, and truths that were impossible to ignore. Her courage became contagious, her resolve a force that even the most cynical could not deny. It was during these efforts that the millionaire began to see the systemic nature of the problem. It was not random misfortune, it was design, neglect, and indifference. Every policy, every loophole, every bureaucracy seemed stacked against the most vulnerable. And the girl, so young, so scarred, yet so fierce, taught him what action truly meant. Not charity, not pity, but justice, advocacy, and accountability. One night, after a long day of meetings that had yielded little progress, they returned to the street. The wind was bitter, the city noisy and indifferent, yet here they were, persistent. She led him to a building where several girls lived, hidden away behind locked gates, their lives constrained by fear and circumstance. They had survived by ingenuity, by silence, by learning quickly that speaking up could be dangerous. But she unlocked the gate, not literally, but in a way far more profound. She introduced them to him, and suddenly the millionaire was confronted by faces that mirrored the world he had left behind. Faces filled with distrust, curiosity, hope, and despair all at once. He knelt down again, meeting their eyes. "I'm here to help," he said softly, deliberately. "I can't fix everything, but I want to make sure you are safe and that you have a voice." One of the older girls, her eyes wary and hard, stepped forward. "We've heard that before," she said. "People say that, but then they leave. Why would you stay?" He paused, sensing the truth in her words. His response came not from rehearsed speeches, but from the marrow of his grief and newfound purpose. "Because I've lost someone I loved, and I understand what it means to feel powerless. And because she," he gestured to the black homeless girl, "believes it can be different. And if she believes it, then I will too. We will fight together." The room was silent for a long moment, heavy with skepticism, hope, and the fragile beginning of trust. Then, slowly, they began to open up. They shared stories of neglect, abuse, hunger, and fear. They spoke of dreams they had been forced to bury, talents and gifts unrecognized, and brilliance left to fade in the shadows. The millionaire listened, heart aching, mind racing, and began to understand that change required more than resources. It required commitment, creativity, and courage. Over the following weeks, they worked tirelessly. Together, they developed safe spaces, organized meals, created emergency plans for danger, and began documenting abuses that had long gone unreported. The girl's knowledge of the streets and her ability to read danger and understand human behavior became indispensable. She taught him what it meant to truly see the people behind the statistics, to value life not in numbers, but in dignity and resilience. But change did not come easily. There were threats, setbacks, and moments when hope seemed almost too fragile to hold. Some nights, the millionaire would lie awake in his mansion, haunted by the fear that they might fail, that they could not protect the vulnerable against the brutality of a system that thrived on neglect. And yet, every time he doubted, he thought of her, the girl who had refused to be broken, who had spoken the truth when no one else would. And he would rise again, determined to match her courage with action. There were victories too, small victories at first, children able to sleep safely through the night, families receiving aid, predators held accountable. But each victory sparked momentum, inspiring others to join the effort. Journalists began to take notice, local leaders were confronted, and slowly, the world beyond the alleyways began to acknowledge the reality the streets had long endured. And throughout it all, the girl never sought praise or recognition. She simply worked, relentlessly, driven by a moral compass honed by survival and shaped by the injustice she had endured. And in the quiet moments, when the city slept and the streets lay empty, the millionaire reflected on the transformation within himself. Grief, he realized, was not just sorrow, it could be a catalyst for justice. Privilege, when combined with courage and guided by conscience, could become a weapon against oppression. And hope, fragile and fleeting as it seemed, could flourish when nurtured by the brave and relentless. The partnership between the two, one shaped by wealth and loss, the other by survival and defiance, grew stronger, built not only on shared purpose, but on mutual recognition of human dignity. They were unlikely allies, bound by circumstance and moral imperative, yet unstoppable in their commitment to right the wrongs that had long been ignored. And so, as the city continued its indifferent rhythm, as streets hummed and lights flickered and shadows danced, they pressed on. Each step, each effort, each act of courage created ripples. They knew the fight was far from over, that the dangers were many, and that the world would resist change at every turn. But armed with purpose, resilience, and an unbreakable bond, they would not falter. For tonight, the millionaire was no longer just a man in mourning, and the girl was no longer just a survivor. Together, they were a force capable of challenging the very fabric of neglect, injustice, and fear. The night had not ended, it had only begun. And in the darkness, a spark of revolution, hope, and justice burnt brighter than ever before. The city had grown quieter in the early hours, yet the pulse of its streets never truly ceased. The millionaire and the girl moved among the alleyways with purpose, not just as visitors or observers, but as agents of change. The children, once huddled and silent, now greeted them with cautious smiles and glimmers of hope. Their laughter, fragile yet determined, echoed against brick walls that had long known only neglect. The fight had escalated. Reports of systemic abuse and neglect were being investigated. Local authorities, once indifferent, were now confronted by evidence too compelling to ignore. Social workers and volunteers began to appear, guided by the documentation the girl and the millionaire had tirelessly compiled. The streets were still dangerous, still harsh, but cracks in the armor of indifference were appearing. The world was beginning to see what she had been shouting about for years. One evening, under a street lamp that flickered like a heartbeat, the girl looked at him with a gravity that had only deepened over time. "Sir," she said, voice steady, "there's more work to do. But the girls, they're safer now. They sleep without fear. They eat. And they talk about their dreams again. That's everything." He nodded, a lump forming in his throat. There was so much left to do, yet in this moment he allowed himself to feel the weight of victory, however small. "You did this," he said softly. "You guided me. You led the way. I just followed." She shook her head, her eyes fierce yet tender. "No, you chose to follow. You chose to stand. That's what matters. Courage is not given. It is claimed. You claimed it." The millionaire realized then that her words were not just about the streets or the children. They were about life itself. It's about grief transformed into action, about privilege transformed into justice, about survival transformed into dignity. He had entered this world as a man in mourning, haunted by loss and helplessness. But now he was something more, A witness, a protector, a force capable of amplifying voices that had long been silenced. Their efforts expanded. They established a safe house, a place where children could learn, grow, and heal. The girl, once homeless and voiceless, became a teacher, a mentor, and a leader. Her courage inspired others from her street, those who had felt powerless, to step forward, to act, to fight for dignity. The millionaire, still haunted by his loss, channeled his grief into funding programs, advocating for policy change, and leveraging his influence to ensure that no child would be invisible, no girl forgotten. One afternoon, as sunlight filtered through the dusty windows of the safe house, a young girl approached the black homeless girl, the same one who had once led the millionaire into the alleyways. Her eyes were wide, brimming with tears, but this time they were tears of relief, of hope. "Thank you," she whispered. "Because of you, I feel safe. I can dream again." The girl knelt to meet her gaze, a rare, gentle smile breaking across her face. "You never needed me," she said quietly. "You only needed to believe that someone cared. That's how change begins." The millionaire watched from the doorway, heart swelling. He understood now that wealth without purpose was hollow, that grief could be transformed into a weapon against injustice, and that true courage often lived in the hearts of those society deemed powerless. This girl, who had once been nothing more than a shadow in the alleys, had become a beacon, not just for her street, but for a world that needed to see the dignity and resilience of Black lives. But victory did not mean the struggle was over. There were still threats, still bureaucracies to navigate, still hearts hardened by indifference. One evening, after a particularly long day of advocacy and protection work, the girl turned to him and said, "Sir, you've done more than you know. But the streets, they're always changing. Danger never sleeps. We have to be ready, always." He placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "Then we'll keep going. Together. Because I've learned something you already knew. Standing for what is right is not a choice, it's a responsibility. And I will carry it as long as I can breathe." The city, vast and indifferent as it seemed, began to change in small, tangible ways. Police patrols increased in previously ignored neighborhoods, social services became more accessible, and community leaders who had once turned away now stepped in. And everywhere, children smiled, laughed, and slept without fear. The girl and the millionaire had forged a bond that transcended circumstance, class, and past suffering. One night, as they walked through the now familiar streets, they paused at the edge of a playground. The swings moved gently in the breeze, carrying echoes of children's laughter. She looked at him, eyes reflecting the street lamp's glow. "We've come a long way," she said softly. "Yes," he replied, "but the road continues. And as long as it does, we will walk it." And in that moment, the millionaire understood fully that life's purpose was not measured by wealth or status, but by the courage to face injustice and the determination to fight for dignity. He had entered this world in mourning, a man burdened by personal loss, yet he had emerged transformed, carrying hope, justice, and the strength to act. She smiled faintly, almost imperceptibly, yet in that smile was the history of struggle, the depth of endurance, and the power of resilience. He had entered this world in mourning, a man burdened by personal loss, yet he had emerged transformed, carrying hope, justice, and the strength to act. She smiled faintly, almost imperceptibly, yet in that smile was the history of struggle, the depth of endurance, and the power of resilience. "We fight for more than ourselves," she said. "We fight for every child, every life, every voice that has been silenced." And together they did just that. The streets had not lost their darkness, nor had the city abandoned its indifferent rhythm. But a light burnt now, small yet unwavering, a light born of courage, conviction, and the unbreakable bond between two people who refused to accept injustice as destiny. And as they moved forward, through alleys, into homes, across the fractured city, they carried with them the knowledge that change, though hard-won, was possible, and that dignity, once claimed, could never be taken away. In the end, it was not wealth, grief, or circumstance that defined them. It was the courage to stand, the determination to act, and the relentless refusal to allow silence and fear to dominate the lives of those who deserved so much more. The girl, once homeless and unheard, became a symbol of unyielding strength. The millionaire, once lost in mourning, became a vessel for justice. And together, they proved that even in the harshest shadows, the human spirit could shine with extraordinary brilliance. The city would remember them, not for fame, not for wealth, but for something far more enduring: the power of empathy, courage, and unbreakable resolve. And somewhere, deep in the alleys, amidst the streets they had once walked alone, children now slept peacefully, dreaming not of hunger or fear, but of possibility, pride, and a future shaped by those who dared to stand. The fight was far from over, but the spark was lit. And in that spark lay hope, dignity, and the unshakable truth that one voice, one action, and one act of courage could change the world.